Hi, everyone. So my name is Anderson Frailey, and for the next 20 or so minutes, I'm going to be talking to you all about how we can adopt sort of open source technologies and best practices in our public policy analysis, and not only how, but like why we should, and what kind of problems that are caused by our current closed source model. So quick about me, I work on a number of open source projects related to tax modeling, including Tax Calculator, which is an open source microsimulation model I'll be talking about a few times throughout the talk, and then Tax Data, which is a project that actually prepares the data to go into Tax Calculator. And I'm also a research associate at the Open Source Policy Center, which is part of the American Enterprise Institute, a think tank in DC. So just to get started, what do I mean by open source policy analysis? So for one, open data is not open source policy analysis. So we've seen recently a big initiative by a lot of local and federal government agencies to publish the data that they've collected over the years to do their work and make these nice web portals for anyone to go and download that data for whatever they want to use it for. And that's certainly in the same vein of what I want to talk about. It's pro-open government, and it's a fantastic initiative that we should definitely encourage and continue, but it's not quite what I mean by open source policy analysis. So when I talk about open source policy analysis, I'm talking more about the models that produce these reports that we saw during the recent tax bill and healthcare debates. And these models can really be a bit of anything. They're sometimes just these simple Excel spreadsheets. They're sometimes the big, long Jupyter notebooks. And there's sometimes this big just jumble of code written in any kind of language, from Python to Fortran to Stata to R, and really anything you can think of. But fundamentally, they all can be thought of as software products, or at least close to software products. So that means that a lot of the benefits we see from open source technologies like Pandas or NumPy, or whatever the projects most of y'all work on, can also be applied to policy analysis in these models. So let's start with just what we do currently and how a bill is sort of analyzed and debated over. So we start with a bill, or more accurately, the idea of a bill, or what kind of legislation somebody wants to do. And then we take that bill and we put it in this box. And then in the box, we toss in some mathematical models and sprinkle a little data on there. And then we just close the box and let the models work their magic. And then out pops a report like this that we saw during the healthcare debate, or like this that we saw during the Tax Cuts and Jobs debate. And that's all well and good for most people. They get everything they need out of it. Reporters have numbers they can report on. Politicians have numbers they can talk about. But for people like me, we're kind of stuck wondering, well, what's in the box? And you might wonder, like, why does this matter? Aren't the people making these models PhDs? They're well-trained economists. They know what they're talking about. And that's all true, and I don't want you to leave this talk thinking you can't trust any number you see in a report ever. But the fact of the matter is these models, they can have bugs in them, and then a lot of these tiny assumptions that they make can make pretty substantial differences in what the model actually outputs. So as an example, I took that tax calculator model I mentioned earlier, and I decided to see what would happen if we repealed the latest tax law, at least the individual portions of it. So you can see 4 lines here, and these are all just tax revenue over time. So the blue line is current law or under TCJA. The red line is a static reform, which just means we assume no change in people's behaviors. And then the green and purple lines are when we start to assume that people might change how they behave and where their income comes from when they start to work, or when their tax liabilities change. And if we look at how much revenue is actually going to be raised under these different assumptions, we can see pretty stark differences. So under the static reform, again, where we assume no change in behavior, we're raising almost $1.5 trillion, or at least that's what we project to raise. But as soon as we say people are going to change their behavior when the taxes go up, we start dropping down to $952 billion. And if we assume a larger change, well, now we're down to $658 billion. So that's almost $800 billion just gone based on basic economic assumptions. And most of these will come up in some policy report, as they write up the model. But it still goes to show that these small changes can really push these models to show different results. So now for the rest of this talk, I want to talk a little bit about, again, these problems with closed source analysis and how open source can sort of alleviate them. some project highlights, and then how do we move forward to a more open nature of policy reporting. So there are 4 problems I'm going to focus on. There's politics and the politicization of numbers. There's the bugs that we find in these models and their effects. Then there's policy backlog and communicating the actual results of the models. So for starters, we have politics. So every politician loves the wonk who's going to crunch a bunch of numbers for them and spit out some beautiful report to tell the world how their brilliant legislation is going to make everything better. Until those wonks tell them that maybe that legislation isn't the best. Maybe it's going to actually cause some problems. Then you get stuff like this, where now we're attacking the CBO's reputation because apparently they have faulty numbers, and that leads to bad results. Or this, where a tax study that Democrats didn't like was now fake math. And that was sort of just where the criticism ended. Or it's just a work of fiction. And there's no real substance to these criticisms. There's no one's actually going in and saying, oh, it's bad because they made these poor assumptions. It's just bad. And this really isn't new. Like the CBO was founded in the Carter administration, and their first report knocked an energy plan proposed by the administration, so the administration pushed back and said the numbers were just wrong. And this happened with the Reagan administration and the Clinton administration and the Bush administration and Obama and now Trump, and it's going to continue happening. So will opening up these models and making everything open source solve all these political problems, and we'll suddenly go from fake news to, well, your economic assumptions were wrong, and have this nice highbrow debate? No. But a boy can dream. So there's always going to be somebody to politicize these results. That's just inevitable. That's how these games work. But what we can hope is that if we make these models open, we're at least going to elevate the debate beyond fake news and fake math to an actual discussion about what's going into the models themselves. So next we have bugs. I'm sure every single one of you has encountered a bug in your program at some point, some minor, some small. And if y'all actual software people are doing it, you can guarantee that economists are doing it as well. For example, you might have heard of the Reinhardt-Rogoff paper a few years back that correlated high government deficits with a slowdown in GDP growth over time. Well, it turns out they messed up their spreadsheet. They forgot to drag the formula down to cover a few extra cells. Or during the tax policy debate, the Tax Policy Center put out a report, gained a lot of news coverage that said X, Y, Z about tax reform, only to realize they made a mistake as well and had to retract it. And Tax Policy Center actually deserves a lot of credit for issuing a formal retraction, because what a lot of organizations could have done and would have done is just release a new report and said, oh, we updated our data, or something similar. Been very vague about what happened because the models are a black box, so no one would have been none the wiser. So if we make these models open, we get the same benefits we get from making software open. We have more eyes on these bugs. The Reinhardt-Rogoff paper, that bug was spotted when they sent the spreadsheet to a grad student who was trying to replicate the results. So as we get more eyes on these, of people of all levels of expertise, we're going to find more of these problems and be able to fix them. So then we have what I like to call the policy backlog. Updating these models, modifying them to be specific to your policy, it takes a lot of time and a lot of brain power. So a lot of groups like the CBO or the JCT, Joint Committee on Taxation, or any of the many think tanks who do this kind of work, they're only going to model policy that's actually going to become law. So take single-payer healthcare. That's gained a whole lot of traction lately, but let's be honest, it's not going to become law anytime soon under the current administration and Congress. So as curious as people are about it, they're never going to get a formal modeling of it. So they're not ever going to really know the results. In fact, the CBO actually puts out these guidelines about when they step in during the policymaking process. And when legislation is under development, it's like when the numbers, like the new tax rates or the new structure of healthcare are being decided, all they're doing is informal help. So maybe like a couple back of the envelope calculations, maybe like, well, we think this would happen. But there's no formal model being run. It's not until the bill's already gone to committee that they're going to actually put forth a formal estimate. And at that point, it's a whole excess process to make changes. Now you got to submit all these changes to the bill. It's got to go back to the committee, and it's a whole ordeal. So just imagine if instead of all that, these models were open and people could start testing their policy and iterating over different policy ideas until they see the results that they want to see. And I mentioned Tax Calculator, and we actually built a web interface for it so that anyone can go in and start plugging in tax numbers. And this is actually data for the number of runs that we saw per day over a few months. And this gray box you can see is the basically tax reform season. So from the day that the bill was first introduced and the day that it was signed into law. And you can see a few huge spikes in the number of runs we saw per day of like 50 to 60% increase. And this was always triggered by some kind of news. So they'd update the bill. Or somebody like the New York Times would write an article, and then people would be like, oh, well, no, I'm curious. Let me go run this myself. So there is this demand out there for people to be able to go and see a bill and how it will affect them more. So finally, the last problem is actually communicating the results. So this is, and it's a little hard to read, but basically this is what you get from a lot of the formal tax policy reports. They have 10 years, and each year they're just going to show how much revenue is going to change for that year, and then how much you're going to get in total over those 10 years. And that's all great. That's important to know. We obviously want to know how much revenue we are going to lose or gain from tax reform. But this doesn't tell me anything about how that reform is going to affect me or you or really anybody. And they might have a few distributional tables that are very vague, but you're never going to really know the details because they don't have the room to publish the details. These reports are already dense enough that if they had a page on how everybody was getting affected by it, they would just be never ending. So what we saw during tax reform was actually really cool. Y'all might recognize this graphic from the New York Times, where you could go in and plug in that, oh, I'm a single filer, I make X number of dollars per year, I take the standard deduction, I have so many kids. And they built this so that those dots, as you filled in your information, would actually filter themselves out. And you could see how much your taxes are going to change, or how much will your after-tax income change. And CNN actually built a similar model, where you can go in, again, put your filing status, put your income, put what state you lived in, and then you'd see, will your taxes go up or down, and by how much. And Washington Post, same thing. So what these all have in common, though, is that they were all built on that open source tax calculator. So these were only possible because there was this open source technology for the brilliant reporters at New York Times, Washington Post, and CNN to go in and build a model on top of it so that their readers could go in and see exactly how they'd be affected by tax reform. And not only that, but all three of those articles, we were told at least, were some of the most popular ones they had over that time frame. So again, there's a very clear and present demand for people to go in and get the details of how they'll be affected by policy. And we can only really make that a reality by making these models open source so that people can build on top of that. So moving forward, well, what does open policy analysis look like? What kind of complications are going to come with it? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the projects and initiatives that are already underway to move us towards more open policy analysis. So what does open source policy analysis look like? The gold standard would obviously be replicability. We've seen this movement in a lot of the more scientific fields, where if you're going to publish in a journal, you have to publish huge code and data along with it. And that, again, is the gold standard. And it would allow anyone to go in, download your code and data, and get the exact same results as you. Unfortunately, that's not always possible, especially in policy analysis, because a lot of this data is extremely personal and sensitive. So like the tax models, for example, will often have people's actual tax data that it's running on. So tax returns that some real person has filed, and it'll be recalculated their tax liability under these new policy parameters. So the next best option we can really hope for is to have open code and then just data transparency. So you publish your code, then you at the very least attribute your code or your data to a certain source, and you publish all the methods you'd use to edit and clean that data for your models. So there are a few complications with this, of course. As I said, privacy. These models are very, very sensitive data often. But we can do certain other techniques to get around some of this. So synthetic data sets, for example, you can go in, take people's actual tax information, and then create new tax units and records. in a way that they still represent the same distribution and total numbers, but each unit is no longer an actual person. It's very generalized. And Tax Policy Center is actually working on a project to do just that. Or you could have these private data centers where organization like the IRS will have this data available. That you can go in, build your model outside on some fake data set, take your computer to the IRS, run the code, take the results on with you to make your actual reports. So either of these would be better than our current options, which is basically nothing. Then there's also the publishing incentives. So if a lot of these economists and researchers, they're going to put a lot of time and effort into making these models and collecting data. And a lot of consulting firms are making money just hand over fist doing tax analysis for people. So what real incentives do they have to make it open and potentially cut off the source of revenue? And I get it, that's a very valid concern. My personal opinion is if you're making software that's affecting public policy, that's going to affect the rest of the country, it should be open, people should be able to look at it. But also maybe we just need to change how we incentivize people who are making these models. So we've seen movements in like the Journal of Open Source Software where you can now actually publish papers about your software and get citations. So in academia and think tanks, citations are everything. So something like the Journal of Open Source Software is a great way to give the authors of these models some credit while also making it more open for everybody else. And then you have this malicious outside influence. And obviously the good part about making this code open is that anybody can go and review it. And ideally, a bunch of experts will be able to go and make suggestions to whoever it is to update their code and model specifically. The bad side is that anybody can look over the code and make suggestions. And the people who typically have the time, resources, and staff power to do that might not always be the most well-intentioned. They might have their own policies to push. But the thing is, this is happening anyway. There are these groups who are trying to tell the CBO and JCT and think tanks how they should do their modeling. And the difference is we just don't know about it. So if we at least open it up, we're still going to have this influence, but at the very least, we'll all know who's trying to influence what and how the numbers are being changed. So a few projects and initiatives that I've been seeing and been very encouraged by that are moving us to more open policy analysis. So starting off, we have Tax Calculator, as I mentioned a few times. It's an open source microsimulation model. You can use it to analyze various tax reforms or current law. And it's all written in Python. It's a nice Python package you can download off of Conda. And it's very simple to use. You specify a couple different types of Python objects. You put those all in a calculator. And then you can run with it. And then, because it is open source and we want to make it as accessible as possible, we built what we call TaxBrain on top of it. So this is a website where anyone can go in, whether or not they know how to program or they know anything about taxes really, and start plugging in numbers. Maybe change the lowest income tax rate to 0 and the highest one to 50% and see how much revenue changes by 10 years and see who's affected by that. You can get distributional tables, revenue analysis, all on a very simple website that usually only takes a couple minutes to run. And then the CBO, who I've talked about a lot, has actually done a great job recently about trying to increase their transparency. So they're testifying in front of Congress more. They're publishing more detailed reports on their models and their data. And they actually have started releasing some data and code as well. So it's been great to see them actually pushing the transparency initiative sort of unprompted. But as a more stick approach to it, there's also the CBO Show Your Work Act, which has been introduced in the Senate, which would basically codify some of the things I've talked about. It will require a CBO to publish all their models and their data, unless that data is sensitive. And in the case where the data is sensitive, they have to at least publish summary statistics for everything. So to wrap up, I think I'm starting to run a little short on time. Right now, policy analysis is conducted in a black box. And policy analysis is complicated, it's error-prone, and it could frankly use a lot of collaboration to be better. So this black box approach really presents just a number of issues that sort of compound over time that people either don't really acknowledge or just kind of ignore a little bit. So if we open that box and allow a little more influence from experts and people who don't work directly for these organizations but know a thing or two about modeling, we can definitely get better results, a better informed public, and just better policy in general. And yes, there will be complications with this, but in my opinion at least, it's absolutely worth grappling with those externalities to get the benefits of open analysis. So with that, thank you for coming out. If you want to contact me, you can here. And if we have time, I can take a couple questions. Yes?
Yeah, I just tried to get on and I got a server error. So my question is, talk to you after you're done. So
Yeah.
get on.
Cool.
The comment is, it's excellent. I didn't know it existed. I'm happy to learn about it. That's my background as well. So
Right.
just learning more about what you have. There's something that I can contribute to that.
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, all these projects are open source, so it's all up on GitHub. You can find it. So the Open Source Economics is the organization name. So if you want to go and do a little tax modeling, we'd welcome your contribution. And also, we're all economists writing code, so if you can go through and see as like software actual developers and see where we could be better, we'd definitely appreciate it. So, yes.
So a lot of the examples that you showed that are available today pertain to you as an individual, how are you going to be affected by this tax bill or whatever the change is. Is there an aspect to those applications where you can put in your own information, but then it will also tell you, hey, so you are one of this many number of people in the country who fit into this tax bracket and give aggregate results?
Sort of. So what we have on TaxBrain is we'll come up with, we have like income tables, so you can see people by income bracket, like who have income between like $10,000 to $20,000, how many of them there are, how much each person tax, what percentage of that group will see a tax increase or decrease. So yes, on TaxBrain there is a way to kind of get at that. You can't put in your information like plugged into the model and get an exact result, but you can find yourself in the group and see what people like you would be changed by, yes.
Thank you.
Right, yes.
Just wonder, do you have any sort of plans like ahead of tax calculate what will be the next project?
So we're working on that. We're hoping to get a little more contribution from other types of models, and so I know we have some guys working on like a paid family leave model. We have some macroeconomic models, so dealing with the actual like growth, change in GDP growth from policies. So, and then we're just open to really any kind of public policy model that we can make open. So, yeah, if any of y'all know anybody working on some cool models, let me know, and we can maybe get that open sourced and online.
You don't have to name any names, but are there any representatives or senators that are about your organization or are very
Yes.
supportive of it?
Yes. So we got a lot of use. We got some use in the Obama administration. The Trump campaign team actually used the tax model. We've gotten some use on the Hill. So we have a very bipartisan user base, which is good. But we're always trying to expand that out as much as we can. Yes.
Do you see any schools using this? Have you had teachers reach out?
Yep. So I want to say there are 50 or so universities who have been using it. We had a guy who did a lot of great work to reach out to these universities' econ departments. So we have been able to incorporate it in a few public economics classes. But again, we're trying to get it out there as much as possible. We know curriculums can sometimes be a little stiff. So I know I would have loved something like this when I was an undergrad studying economics. So yeah, we have seen some student usage, mostly on the website, more so than like the Python API. Yeah, you had your hand up.
I don't know anything about the economical side of that, but you showed those like different, I guess, estimates, conservative, like how people behave, and I wonder, how do you even estimate how people? Like, probably there are a lot of corporations or rich people who try to, to find edge cases and
right.
APR.
Right. So that behavior is and I'm going to get a little wonky here. That's known as the elasticity of taxable income, and there are a number of economics papers that are tried to measure it. And you can basically think of it as, and again, I'm going to get a little nerdy, so sorry. It's the concept of like the marginal tax rate, so the tax rate you're paying on the next dollar you make. So let's say before reform, your marginal tax rate is 30%. So therefore, you're actually, of the dollar you make, you're taking home 70 cents on that dollar. Now let's say your marginal tax rate goes up to 50%. So now you're only taking home 50% of that income, of that dollar. So the behavior assumption says you can either react one of two ways. You can one say, well now the work I had to put forward to earn that next dollar suddenly isn't worth it, and now you're just not going to work to make that next dollar. So tax revenue is going to go down because that next dollar isn't being made, and therefore taxed. Or you can say, well now I need to work even more to make sure my after-tax income stays the same. So now you're going to work more, and you might get to see a little bump in tax revenue because people are working more to keep their income the same. And that's basically the assumption that we're doing for a model like this. So I think in this one, in the reform I specified, I leaned more towards the next dollar is not worth it, just to kind of emphasize how that can change. But there are a number of academic papers that go into trying to estimate that exact level. Cool. Perfect timing. So yeah, I'll be around if you have any more questions, but thanks again for coming out.